Margaret O'Sullivan had spent 43 years walking the sterile halls of Blackwater State Penitentiary. Her worn white shoes squeaked against the polished concrete floors as she made her rounds, checking on inmates who suffered from everything from broken bones to broken spirits. At 68 years old, she had seen more violence, despair, and human suffering than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. The prison sat like a concrete fortress on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers that cast long shadows across the barren landscape. Inside its walls, the worst criminals in the state served their time, and many would never see freedom again. Margaret had tended to murderers, rapists, gang leaders, and men whose crimes were so horrific that even hardened guards whispered about them in hushed tones. But nothing in her 4 decades of service had prepared her for what the inmates called the Dragon Cell. Cell Block D, Level 7, Unit 23. The very mention of these numbers made seasoned correctional officers cross themselves. It was a solitary confinement cell that had earned its fearsome reputation through a series of impossible and terrifying events. 7 men had been placed in that cell over the past 2 years. 7 men had died in ways that defied explanation. The first was Marcus Mad Dog Rodriguez, a gang leader serving life for multiple murders. He was found hanging from the ceiling, but there was no rope, no bed sheets, nothing he could have used to hang himself. His neck showed clear strangulation marks, but the security cameras showed him alone in the cell when it happened. The footage revealed him pacing normally one moment, then suddenly clutching his throat and being lifted off the ground by invisible hands. The second victim was Tommy Brennan, a con man who had bilked elderly people out of their life savings. Guards found him in the morning with his body twisted into an impossible position, every bone broken, as if something had grabbed him and wrung him out like a wet towel. The autopsy revealed that his bones had been crushed with tremendous force from the inside out, something medical experts said was physically impossible. Dr. Emily Chun, the prison's chief medical officer, had examined each body personally. A woman of science with degrees from prestigious universities, she prided herself on logical thinking and evidence-based conclusions. But the Dragon Cell cases left her speechless. The injuries were unlike anything in medical literature. She filed report after report, each one more bewildering than the last. The third death was perhaps the most disturbing. Frank Morrison, a serial killer who had terrorized 3 states, was discovered with deep claw marks across his entire body. The wounds appear to have been made by something with talons the size of kitchen knives. But the cell had been searched thoroughly, and no weapon was ever found. More puzzling still, the claw marks seemed to come from inside his body, as if something had torn him apart from within. Word spread quickly through the prison population. Inmates who had spent their lives intimidating others now lived in fear. The Dragon Cell became a weapon of psychological warfare. Guards would threaten unruly prisoners with a stay in Unit 23, and even the most hardened criminals would immediately fall in line. The mere mention of the cell was enough to maintain order throughout the entire facility. Warden James Peterson was a practical man who had run prisons for 25 years. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or supernatural nonsense. But he couldn't ignore the facts. 3 inmates dead under impossible circumstances in the same cell. The State Department of Corrections was asking questions he couldn't answer. The media was starting to sniff around. Something had to be done. Peterson called in experts from the state university. Paranormal investigators, despite his skepticism, were granted access to study the cell. They set up cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, temperature sensors, and recording equipment. For 2 weeks, they monitored every square inch of Unit 23. Their findings were inconclusive, but deeply unsettling. The temperature in the cell dropped by 20 degrees without warning at random intervals. Electronic equipment malfunctioned constantly. Strange sounds were recorded, sounds that analysis revealed to be similar to the breathing of a large animal, though no animal was present. Most disturbing of all, thermal imaging occasionally showed a massive heat signature in the cell when it was empty, a shape that appeared to be roughly 15 feet long with what looked like wings. Despite these findings, the prison couldn't simply abandon the cell. Blackwater was overcrowded, and every unit was needed. The decision was made to continue using the cell, but only for the most dangerous inmates who posed threats to guards and other prisoners. It was seen as a last resort, a place to send those who couldn't be controlled by conventional means. The fourth death occurred 3 months later. Ricardo Santos, a drug lord responsible for dozens of murders, lasted only 2 days in the dragon cell. Guards found him pressed flat against the wall of his cell, as if he had been crushed by an enormous weight. Every bone in his body was pulverized, and his internal organs were completely destroyed. The concrete wall behind him showed a perfect impression of his body, pressed into the solid surface as if the wall were made of clay. By now, even the most skeptical staff members were beginning to believe that something supernatural was at work. Guards refused to do security checks on Unit 23 alone. Maintenance workers would only enter the cell in groups of 3 or more, and even then, they completed their work as quickly as possible. The entire level seemed to be infected with an atmosphere of dread and terror. Margaret O'Sullivan watched these events unfold with growing concern. As the head nurse, she was responsible for the medical care of every inmate, including those in solitary confinement. She had tried to examine the bodies after each death, but the injuries were so severe and inexplicable that there was little she could do. Each time, she filled out her reports with a growing sense that something beyond human understanding was loose in the prison. The fifth death was different from the others. Jake Williams, a bank robber with a history of violence, was found alive but completely insane. He was discovered sitting in the corner of his cell, rocking back and forth and whispering to something that wasn't there. His hair had turned completely white overnight, and his eyes held a look of terror so profound that it unsettled even veteran psychiatrists. Williams was transferred to the prison's psychiatric wing, where he spent his remaining days drawing pictures of a massive dragon-like creature with scales as black as midnight and eyes like burning coals. He would speak to no one about what he had seen, but his drawings were detailed and consistent. They showed a creature of immense size and obvious intelligence, something that seemed to exist partially in shadow and partially in flame. 3 weeks after his transfer, Williams was found dead in his psychiatric cell. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but the medical staff knew better. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and his body showed signs of extreme stress that suggested he had literally been frightened to death. Even in the psychiatric wing, 20 floors away from the dragon cell, whatever had been in Unit 23 had found him. The sixth victim was Carlos Mendez, a hitman who had worked for organized crime families. He lasted 1 night in the dragon cell. Guards found him in the morning burned beyond recognition, though there was no source of fire in the cell. The burns covered his entire body and appear to have been caused by intense heat applied from the inside out. The concrete walls and floor of the cell showed no signs of fire damage, and the sprinkler systems had never activated. The prison's fire marshal conducted a thorough investigation, but could find no explanation for how the burns occurred. The patterns were unlike anything caused by conventional fire, chemical burns, or electrical damage. Dr. Chin's autopsy revealed that Mendez had been cooked alive from within, his internal organs reaching temperatures that should have been impossible to achieve without completely destroying the cell around him. By this point, the dragon cell had gained a reputation that extended far beyond the walls of Blackwater State Penitentiary. Criminal defense attorneys were using it in their arguments, claiming that sending their clients to Blackwater constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Civil rights organizations were filing lawsuits. The story had leaked to the media, and reporters were camping outside the prison gates, demanding answers about the mysterious deaths. Warden Peterson was under enormous pressure from the state government to resolve the situation. The dragon cell was becoming a liability that threatened the entire prison system's reputation. State investigators were conducting their own inquiry, and there was talk of federal intervention if the deaths continued. Peterson knew that his career and possibly his freedom, depended on finding a solution to the dragon cell mystery. The seventh death changed everything. Vincent "Vinny" Torino was different from the previous victims. Unlike the others, Torino was not a violent criminal. He was serving time for white-collar crimes, tax evasion, and embezzlement. He was a small, quiet man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. His placement in the dragon cell was purely administrative, the result of overcrowding in the general population units. Torino lasted 4 days in Unit 23, longer than anyone since the deaths began. During those 4 days, something unprecedented happened. The security cameras captured footage that would change how everyone at Blackwater viewed the dragon cell situation. On the third night, the thermal imaging systems detected not one, but 2 heat signatures in the cell. One was clearly human, cowering in the corner. The other was massive, serpentine, and seemed to be circling the terrified man like a predator playing with its prey. But the most shocking moment came when the audio pickups recorded Torino speaking to whatever was in the cell with him. His voice was barely a whisper, but the digital enhancement equipment picked up his words clearly. He was pleading, begging for his life, but more importantly, he was addressing the entity by name. "Please, Sithrakus," Torino could be heard saying. "I know what they did to you. I know about the experiments. I know about Dr. Harrison and Project Draconus. Please don't kill me. I can help you get revenge on the people who really deserve it." The prison's technical staff played and replayed that recording dozens of times. The name Sithrakus meant nothing to anyone at first, but the mention of Dr. Harrison and Project Draconus set off alarm bells throughout the prison administration. A search of the facility's records going back 50 years revealed information that had been classified and buried for decades. Dr. Marcus Harrison had been Blackwater's chief medical officer from 1962 to 1971. During those years, the prison had participated in several government-sponsored research projects, including psychological experiments and pharmaceutical testing on inmates. Project Draconus was listed in the records, but most of the files have been destroyed or moved to classified government archives. What little information remained was disturbing. The project appeared to involve genetic experiments conducted on death row inmates who had volunteered in exchange for commutations of their sentences. The research focused on enhancing human capabilities through the introduction of modified DNA from various sources. The project was shut down abruptly in 1971 following an incident that resulted in the deaths of 3 researchers and the complete destruction of the facility's medical wing. Margaret O'Sullivan remembered those days. She had been a young nurse then, barely 25 years old, and fresh out of nursing school. She had worked under Dr. Harrison and had assisted with some of the early Project Draconus procedures. The memories she had buried for over 40 years came flooding back as she read the recovered files. The project had started with simple genetic modifications aimed at enhancing human strength and endurance. But Dr. Harrison had become obsessed with more dramatic transformations. He obtained genetic material from various sources, including large predatory animals, and began attempting to create human-animal hybrids. The goal was to produce super soldiers for the military, inmates who could be transformed into living weapons. Most of the subjects died during the early stages of experimentation. Their bodies rejected the foreign genetic material, leading to painful death from organ failure and genetic collapse. But one subject, a death row inmate named Seth Rakowitz, showed remarkable compatibility with the introduced DNA. Rakowitz had been convicted of multiple murders and faced execution, but his unique genetic makeup made him an ideal candidate for the project's most ambitious experiment. Dr. Harrison had obtained genetic material from a Komodo dragon, one of the world's largest and most dangerous predators. The combination of human intelligence and reptilian hunting instincts was intended to create the perfect killing machine. The early results were promising. Rakowitz grew larger and stronger, his reflexes became lightning fast, and his skin developed a tough, scale-like texture that was nearly bulletproof. But the transformation went far beyond what Dr. Harrison had anticipated. Rakowitz's mind began to change along with his body. He developed predatory instincts and an insatiable hunger for violence. His intelligence increased dramatically, but it became cold and calculating, focused entirely on hunting and killing. Most disturbing of all, he began to develop what appeared to be supernatural abilities. Margaret remembered the day everything went wrong. She had been working the night shift when alarms began blaring throughout the medical wing. Rakowitz had somehow broken out of his reinforced containment cell, despite the fact that it was designed to hold the most dangerous criminals. Security cameras showed him moving through the corridors with impossible speed and agility, his body seeming to shift and change as he moved. He killed Dr. Harrison first, tearing him apart with claws that had grown from his fingertips. 2 other researchers died, trying to escape, their bodies found twisted and broken in ways that defied description. Margaret had hidden in a supply closet and listened to the screams and inhuman roars that echoed through the medical wing. The sounds were unlike anything produced by a human throat, deep and rumbling like the growl of some ancient predator. The official record stated that Rakowitz had been killed during the incident, shot by prison guards who responded to the emergency. But Margaret knew that wasn't entirely true. She had seen the aftermath, had helped clean up the destruction left in Rakowitz's wake. There had been blood, lots of it, but no body had ever been recovered. The official explanation was that the body had been destroyed in a fire that consumed much of the medical wing, but Margaret had always suspected that Rakowitz had somehow escaped. Now, 43 years later, it seemed that Seth Rakowitz, or what he had become, had returned to Blackwater. The creature that inmates called the dragon was the result of Dr. Harrison's mad experiments, a fusion of human and reptilian DNA that had taken decades to fully mature. Sethrakus, as he now called himself, had been living somewhere in the hidden spaces of the old prison, growing stronger and more dangerous with each passing year. Vincent Torino's knowledge of Project Draconus remained a mystery. How he had learned about classified government experiments was unclear, but his information had somehow saved his life, at least temporarily. For 4 days, he had negotiated with the creature, trading information about the project for his continued survival. But on the 5th morning, guards found Torino dead like all the others, his body drained of blood through 2 puncture wounds on his neck. The discovery that the dragon cell killings were connected to past government experiments created a political nightmare for everyone involved. Federal agents arrived at Blackwater within hours of the Torino recording being transcribed. They confiscated all records related to Project Draconus and classified the entire dragon cell situation as a matter of national security. Prison staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of federal prosecution. But the federal involvement only made the situation worse. The agents insisted on attempting to capture Sethrakus alive, believing that the creature represented valuable research data that could be used to revive the genetic enhancement program. They brought in military specialists, exotic animal handlers, and research equipment that transformed Unit 23 into a high-tech laboratory. Their first capture attempt was a disaster. Using advanced tranquilizer weapons and electromagnetic containment fields, a team of 6 federal agents entered the dragon cell during what thermal imaging indicated was one of Sethrakus's dormant periods. The security footage of what happened next was so disturbing that it was immediately classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The agents never stood a chance. Sethrakus was far more intelligent and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. He had been aware of their presence from the moment they entered the prison and had laid a trap that demonstrated tactical thinking beyond that of any known predator. The electromagnetic fields designed to contain him proved ineffective, and the tranquilizers had no apparent effect on his enhanced physiology. When the rescue team finally gained access to the cell 6 hours later, they found scenes of carnage that traumatized even hardened military personnel. The 6 agents had been systematically killed in ways that showed Sethrakus had not only intelligence, but a sadistic sense of creativity. Their bodies were arranged in patterns that suggested the creature was trying to send a message to anyone who might attempt to capture him again. Following the failed capture attempt, the federal agents changed their approach. Instead of trying to take Sithrakus alive, they began planning to destroy him using methods that would completely obliterate any trace of his existence. But first, they needed to confirm his location and gather intelligence about his capabilities. This required someone to enter the dragon cell and survive long enough to report back about what they had seen. The agents reviewed the personnel files of every staff member at Blackwater, looking for someone with the knowledge and experience necessary to interact with Sithrakus without immediately becoming his victim. Margaret O'Sullivan's name rose to the top of their list. As one of the few surviving staff members who had worked on Project Draconus, she understood the creature's origins better than anyone. Her decades of experience dealing with dangerous inmates had taught her how to communicate with violent individuals without provoking them. But Margaret was also 68 years old and nearing retirement. She had no combat training and no experience with supernatural threats. The federal agents knew they were essentially sending her to her death, but they believed her unique knowledge might give her a chance to survive long enough to provide the intelligence they needed. They were prepared to sacrifice one elderly nurse to save potentially hundreds of lives if Sithrakus ever escaped from the prison. Margaret O'Sullivan stood outside Unit 23, her weathered hands trembling as she held the medical bag that contained nothing more than basic first aid supplies and a concealed recording device. The federal agents had explained their plan with clinical detachment. She was to enter the dragon's cell, attempt to communicate with Sithrakus, and gather intelligence about his current physical state and capabilities. They estimated she would survive approximately 10 minutes, long enough to transmit useful information before the inevitable happened. Warden Peterson had protested the decision to use Margaret as bait, but the federal agents had made it clear that they had the authority to override his objections. National security trumped local prison administration, and the lives of a few staff members were acceptable losses if they led to resolving the Sithrakus situation. Margaret had volunteered for the assignment, not out of patriotic duty, but because she knew that her 4 decades at Blackwater were about to end one way or another. As the heavy steel door of Unit 23 clanged shut behind her, Margaret found herself alone in the dragon cell for the first time in her career. The cell was larger than standard solitary confinement units, measuring 12 feet by 15 feet with concrete walls that had been reinforced multiple times over the years. Scratch marks covered every surface, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by claws the size of railroad spikes. The cell was cold, much colder than it should have been according to the building's heating system. Margaret could see her breath in small puffs of vapor as she stood near the door, her back pressed against the cold steel. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own nervous breathing and the distant hum of the prison's ventilation system. But she knew she wasn't alone. "I know you're here, Seth," Margaret said softly, using the creature's original human name deliberately. "I was there when Dr. Harrison did this to you. I was there the night you changed, the night you became something more than human." The temperature in the cell dropped another 10 degrees, and Margaret heard a sound like leather sliding across concrete. Something was moving in the shadows of the far corner, something large enough to displace air as it shifted position. The thermal imaging equipment outside the cell would be detecting the massive heat signature that the federal agents had studied for weeks, but Margaret was experiencing it firsthand. "You remember me, don't you?" Margaret continued, her voice steady despite her fear. "I was young then, just 25 years old. You called me Angel because I was the only one who treated you with kindness during the experiments. When Dr. Harrison pushed the treatments too far and you were in pain, I was the one who smuggled extra morphine to help you sleep." A low rumbling sound filled the cell, neither fully animal nor human. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the concrete walls and floor. Margaret felt the vibrations in her bones, a sound that triggered primal fear responses buried deep in human genetic memory. But she stood her ground, remembering the man Seth Rakowitz had been before the experiments destroyed his humanity. "I know what they did was wrong," Margaret said. "Dr. Harrison turned you into a monster against your will. He promised you a commutation of your death sentence in exchange for participating in his research, but he never intended to let you go free. You were just another lab rat to him, something to be experimented on until you died or became useful to the military." The shadows in the corner began to shift and coalesce, and Margaret caught her first glimpse of what Seth Rakowitz had become. The transformation that had started 43 years ago had continued during his decades of hiding in the abandoned sections of Blackwater. He was no longer recognizably human, but he wasn't entirely reptilian either. He was something new, something that evolution had never produced, and hopefully never would again. Sethrakuz stood nearly 8 feet tall when he rose to his full height, his body a fusion of human and dragon characteristics that defied biological classification. His skin was covered in scales that shifted color from deep black to dark green, depending on the angle of the light. His arms had grown longer and more muscular, ending in hands that bore claws capable of tearing through steel. His face retained some human features, but had elongated into a reptilian snout filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh. But it was his eyes that held Margaret's attention. Despite all the physical changes, Seth Rakowitz's human intelligence remained intact, amplified, and sharpened by decades of predatory existence. Those eyes held a combination of animal cunning and human memory that was deeply unsettling. He remembered everything about his former life, including the people who had been kind to him during his transformation. "Angel," Sethrakuz spoke, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emerge from multiple sources within his transformed throat. The word was barely recognizable as human speech, but Margaret understood it clearly. "You came back to me after all these years." "I came back because I felt guilty," Margaret admitted, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I helped Dr. Harrison with those experiments. I watched him turn you into this creature, and I did nothing to stop it. I've carried that guilt for 43 years, Seth. I watched you kill 7 men in this cell, and I know that their blood is on my hands too." Sethrakuz moved closer, his massive form seeming to flow rather than walk across the concrete floor. Margaret could feel the heat radiating from his transformed body, could smell the predatory musk that marked him as something dangerous and wild. But she also sensed something else, something that gave her hope for the first time since entering the cell. Behind the monster that Dr. Harrison had created, traces of the man Seth Rakowitz had once been still existed. He was in pain, not physical pain, but emotional anguish that had festered for decades. The experiments had enhanced his body and mind, but they had also isolated him from all human contact. He had spent 43 years alone in the hidden spaces of Blackwater, growing stronger and more dangerous, but also more desperate for connection with the world he had lost. "You're killing innocent people, Seth," Margaret said gently. "I know some of the men you killed were criminals who deserve punishment, but Vincent Torino was just a white-collar criminal. He had a family, children who will grow up without their father. The federal agents you killed were just doing their jobs. You've become the very thing that Dr. Harrison wanted to create, a killer without conscience or mercy." Sethrakuz stopped moving and tilted his massive head, considering Margaret's words with the intelligence that had made him so dangerous. For a long moment, the only sound in the cell was his breathing, a deep rumbling that reminded Margaret of a sleeping dragon from the fairy tales of her childhood. "They experimented on me," Sethrakuz finally replied, his transformed vocal cords struggling to form human words. "They made me into this thing, then tried to destroy me when I became too dangerous for them to control. I have been alone for so long, Angel, so hungry for contact with something that remembers who I used to be." "I remember," Margaret said, taking a step closer despite every instinct telling her to flee. "I remember Seth Rakowitz, the bank robber who read poetry in his cell and cried when he thought no one was watching. I remember the man who was terrified of the electric chair and agreed to DR. Harrison's experiments because he thought it was his only chance to live. The conversation continued for hours, far longer than the federal agents had expected Margaret to survive. Through the concealed recording equipment, they listened to an impossible dialogue between an elderly nurse and a creature that represented the darkest possibilities of genetic engineering. Margaret had somehow achieved what trained negotiators and military specialists had failed to accomplish. She had established a human connection with something that had transcended humanity itself. As the hours passed, Margaret learned the truth about Sithrakis' existence over the past 4 decades. He had indeed escaped during the chaos that destroyed the medical wing in 1971, but he hadn't left Blackwater. Instead, he had found refuge in a vast network of maintenance tunnels, abandoned cells, and forgotten chambers that honeycombed the old sections of the prison. He had survived by hunting rats and other small animals, gradually growing larger and stronger as his transformation continued to evolve. The dragon cell killings had started as accidents. Sithrakis had been using Unit 23 as a lair, entering through ventilation shafts when the cell was empty and leaving before guards made their rounds. But when inmates began being placed in the cell, his predatory instinct had overwhelmed the remaining traces of his human conscience. He had killed not out of malice, but because his transformed nature compelled him to eliminate any threats to his territory. But the killing had also served another purpose. Each death had been a message, a desperate attempt to communicate with the outside world about his existence and his needs. Sithrakis had hoped that eventually someone would understand what he had become and find a way to help him. The systematic nature of the killings, the impossible circumstances of each death, had all been designed to attract attention from people who might remember Project Draconus and understand his true identity. Margaret's arrival in the cell represented the culmination of 43 years of patience and planning. Sithrakis had known that eventually someone from his past would come looking for him. He had preserved enough of his humanity to recognize that Margaret was different from the federal agents and prison officials who saw him only as a threat to be eliminated. She was someone who remembered Seth Rakowitz as a person rather than an experiment. The resolution came when Margaret proposed a solution that satisfied both Sithrakis' need for survival and society's need for protection. Rather than attempting to kill or capture the creature, she suggested a form of controlled exile that would allow him to live while ensuring he posed no threat to innocent people. The abandoned sections of Blackwater contained enough space for Sithrakis to exist comfortably, and Margaret volunteered to serve as his liaison with the outside world. The federal agents initially rejected the proposal, but Margaret had recorded enough of her conversation with Sithrakis to prove that he retained human intelligence and could be reasoned with. More importantly, she had demonstrated that attempting to destroy him would likely result in massive casualties and public exposure of Project Draconus. The political ramifications of the program becoming public knowledge were too dangerous for the government to risk. A classified agreement was reached that officially designated the abandoned sections of Blackwater as a restricted research facility under federal jurisdiction. Sithrakis would be allowed to continue his existence in exchange for participating in limited medical research that might lead to treatments for genetic disorders. Margaret would serve as his primary caretaker, visiting him regularly to ensure his physical and psychological needs were met. The Dragon Cell was permanently sealed and reclassified as a structural maintenance area. The deaths were officially attributed to a series of mechanical accidents caused by deteriorating infrastructure, and the families of the victims received substantial financial settlements in exchange for their silence. Vincent Torino's knowledge of Project Draconus was explained as the result of his background in financial crimes investigation, which had led him to discover classified government expenditures. Margaret O'Sullivan spent her final years at Blackwater caring for the creature that Seth Rakowitz had become, bringing him books, conversation, and the human contact he had been denied for 4 decades. Their relationship was unique in the history of both medicine and corrections, a bond between a woman nearing the end of her career and a being that represented the dangerous frontier between human and animal nature. When Margaret finally retired at the age of 75, she was replaced by a team of federal researchers who continued her work under the highest levels of security classification. Sithrakus lived for another decade, his enhanced physiology gradually failing as the genetic modifications that had sustained him for so long began to break down. He died peacefully in his sleep, with Margaret holding his clawed hand and reading him poetry as his breathing slowly stopped. The dragon cell remained sealed, but it was no longer a place of terror and death. Instead, it had become a monument to the possibility of redemption, even for those who had been transformed beyond recognition by the cruelty and ambition of others. Margaret's courage in facing the deadliest creature ever housed at Blackwater had not only saved lives, but had also restored a fragment of humanity to something that had been forced to abandon its human nature decades earlier. The true story of the dragon cell was never made public, but it became a legend among prison staff and inmates who understood that sometimes the greatest monsters are created by human hands, and that even the most fearsome creatures can be reached by simple human kindness and understanding.